Hello and welcome to another edition of Off the Cuff. And this is a very special one because we have with us a truly global Indian star and a young global Indian star. And he's not a film star, he's not a cricket star. In fact, I find it tough to describe Ruchir Sharma. He's a global traveler who watches things. I think he manages tens of billions of dollars for very trusting people and then writes his wonderful books. So we are talking about his latest today, Rise and Fall of the Nations.
Thank you.
Ruchir, thank you very much for being here. And since I didn't quite have the intellectual equipment to deal with this, I have for my help Uday, Kotak, who all of you know very well.
Ruchir, your book is truly fascinating, and thank you for sending that copy autographed by you, and I made it a point to read it. And the most interesting aspect about it is what I would start with, and that is about the circle of life. So if you can share with us the human aspect about how leaders very often who come to transform countries and how you've seen change in behavior. You talked about Russia, you talked about Turkey, and how does that play out in the context of the future of nations?
Great. Great to be here after sort of having traveled the world, and it's so nice to be back with familiar faces and back home in Mumbai. So thanks a lot, and delighted to be here. So just coming to your question, the circle of life. So that rule, so the way that I sort of organized the book is that each sort of chapter starts with me sort of, where did I learn this rule? I've been doing this for over 20 years. I started out as a writer 25 years ago and 20 years ago as an investor, and I've been sort of doing this for the last 20 years. So the entire issue is, where did I start? Where this rule occur to me? And it really sort of struck me here that when I first started investing in emerging markets were in complete chaos. And then we had this remarkable decade, last decade, where they did very well. And the couple of leaders who were seen to be behind that comeback of emerging markets last decade were people like Putin and Erdogan. And we tend to forget that in today's context because they've been so vilified, they're seen as these villains by the West. What we forget though is that when they first came to power at the turn of the last decade, they were very different policymakers than what they ended up being now, or they have been in the last few years. And that's what struck me in this visit to Moscow as well, that the Putin that I knew in 2000, 2001 was very different than the Putin I met in 2010. And as you said, that after that visit, I've not gone back to Russia, by the way. So, because the problem with Russia, is the fact that, as they say, that it's not as if he will bump you off, but if somebody else will do it to get him into trouble. The double games going on all the time out there. But just kidding about that. But I think that the whole issue there is the fact that that's what I learned over time, that these leaders change over time. And much of the book is really based on sort of this thought which occurs when you're there, and then to go and backtest it in office and to find out, is this really true? Is this something which is just a hunch, an observation, and can you back it up with some facts? So I went back and we did a whole sort of analysis that when is it that leaders typically do well? What is that point in time when leaders stop doing well? And there are different ways of measuring it. So one very simple way that we measured it was you take the stock market as a very simple gauge of measuring it. And I found a really fascinating statistic, which is that the 90% of outperformance of any stock market in emerging markets tends to happen in the first 2 years of a new leader. And after that, you have diminishing returns to par. In fact, that if you re-elect that good leader for having done good job in the first term, in the second term, ironically, there is no outperformance. And if they by any chance stick around for the third term, there's always underperformance. And that's what's happened with Putin and Erdogan, that they were very different leaders to start with, and what they've become today is very different. And their focus is completely turned away from the economy, and they're really using nationalism to stay in office now and not on bettering the lives of their people.
So what do you think happens to a leader after, say, a few years in office, which changes his outlook about what he or she has come out to do and down the road? And how do you handle this situation?
Yeah, no, this is like an old line that in the end every hero becomes a bore. So I think it's as simple as that. That all these leaders start off very fresh with great energy and things, and then they get sort of caught up in their own echo chamber. And even things like corruption, like against Putin, one thing I could definitively say in his first term was that he was not personally corrupt. There was nothing that he did which was personal. I don't think we can say that with any conviction anymore. Same thing with Erdogan when he started out. Today it's all about what is, son-in-law is based, etc. So I think that all these leaders lose their energy, and they also sort of are caught up in their own echo bubble. They hear only the stuff which is favorable to themselves. And that's what I think in the end. Now, the key with every rule I say is that there are always exceptions to the rule. Somebody will always point up and say Lee Kuan Yew, 27 years, he did fine, etc. That's the point. In life, there are no certainties, only probabilities. And my issue is that the probability of a nation doing well is much better when you elect a new leader, and particularly in the first half of the first term is when you get the maximum bang for the buck.
So as an investor, you buy in the first 2 years and then thereafter sell?
I wish life was that simple, right? So my entire sort of thing here is that you look at all the 10 rules and you see as to how nations score. But on that one rule, I would definitely sort of, believe in that the first term, the first half of the first term is when you get the maximum bang for the buck. Even in terms of economic growth, other variables do much, those take a while to sort of come to fruition. And that's what I've always said even about the current government, that and I think that some of us were saying this right from the get-go, that the first 6 to 12 months, there was no opposition virtually to the government until the Delhi election. And in that period, there's so much more which could have been done. Of course, I'm not saying it's all over, but I do feel that at a time when the world is sort of regressing, when populism is on the increase, the fact that we still have some incremental reform happening is a positive. But you objectively look back and say about how much could have been done in the first 6 to 12 months, and you do feel, a lot more could have been done.
But what did Mr. Modi get wrong? Did he get his team wrong? Did he not understand this? What did he get wrong?
I'm not sure. I don't know. I mean, maybe it's the first 6 to 12 months so caught up in the entire euphoria of what was going on. It could be that. I don't have a judgment on him, in terms of, what it was. But I think that, it could be about people and stuff like that. Not sort of, I think that's a point that you've made in the past of not having enough effective outsiders, sort of helping in this.
Change agents.
Yeah, change agents, yeah.
But Ruchir, despite all that, if I look at your summary and also on some of your other shows, you put India on more than 5 out of 10 in your score of 10.
Right.
So what do you think is working for India?
That's
And also give a summary of your 10 points and say where India does.
Yeah. Well,
Sing for your non-supper.
Right. So very briefly, so I think that's the important one, that on the circle of life, which is one of my first rules, I give India a middling score, because even though I feel disappointed about what could have happened at a time when the rest of the world is regressing and falling to populism, some incremental reform is still going on here. So that's okay. Now, where do I think India ranks relatively well? The first sort of chapter is about the fact that demographics is a necessary but not sufficient condition for high growth. And one of the big trends in the global economy today is that the world's population growth rate is falling off a cliff. This is a huge change which is happening. The working age population of the world the growth rate is really falling. And the two drivers of economic growth, productivity and working age population. And the working age population growth is falling sharply. So, and even India's population growth rate, which we used to curse so much for so long, has fallen dramatically. Our fertility rates, I think, have gone down from 6+ in the 1960s to 2.5 now.
In fact, our net growth rate is 1.4 now.
Yeah, but in terms of the fact that it's still increasing though. Right. So I'd say that's a positive. There are more than 30 countries in the world today where the working age population of those nations is declining, including China. And it is impossible for a country to grow rapidly.
And that ruins their dependency ratios.
Yeah, and it's impossible for a country to grow rapidly when its working age population is declining. So I'd say on that score, I think India ranks relatively well. The other sort of myth which I think was around for a while was the fact that if inflation is going up, it's because growth must be very strong. So as if the fact that high inflation is a sign of high economic growth. And this was my biggest quarrel with the UPA too. The fact, I have this quote out there that there are some mistakes only PhDs can make. And really, so if you look at the former chief economic advisor at that point in time and stuff, having these arguments, and even the prime minister at that point in time would keep arguing with the fact that this inflation is going up because it's a sign of strong demand. Again, went back and checked. our data saw, is this true? And it's completely not true, that all the miracle economies from Korea, Taiwan to China last decade all had low inflation when economic growth was very high because investment was abundant. So there were no supply bottlenecks and stuff like that. So in that regard, I think India finally the inflation rate is coming in line with the emerging market average. So I rank India relatively well out there. The other place I rank India relatively well is the fact that cheap. We think having a cheap currency is not a great thing, and many politicians think of nationalism in terms of having a sort of strong currency. But the fact is the cheap and stable currency has been the bedrock of economic development in China, Korea, Taiwan, again, the miracle economies. So I'd say that on these rules, India ranks relatively well. Even our investment rates are relatively high. Unfortunately, a lot of that is not going into manufacturing, and it's being held up a lot by the public capex. And the other sort of thing I find is the fact that at a time when debt levels across the world have gone up a lot, in India's case, at least the debt levels have stopped going up. I mean, the public debt has stabilized, the private sector's sort of debt levels aren't out of control. Like China's case, I'm really concerned about that. I have a whole chapter dedicated to the case of debt. So I'd say it's these rules where I think India ranks relatively well. The biggest drawbacks about India today, I would find, one is the perils of the state, the fact that the state in India remains far too meddlesome. The other one that I think in India is a real problem, which I find is the lack of second cities. I find this a staggering development, which is that if you look at the case of China, in the last 30 years, there have been 19 new cities which have come up in China. And what do I mean by new cities? These are cities where the population used to be less than 250,000 and now is more than 1 million. And of course, some people, will have some jibes that, some of these are like ghost towns and stuff like that. But that's a silly point. The fact is that you've had an explosion of new cities which have come from nowhere in China. We looked at India. How many new cities have come up in India? And we found the answer was 2 in the last 30 years by this definition. And those 2 were some cities in Kerala where the maps had been redrawn.
Those are census cities.
Census cities, exactly. So the fact that we don't have any new cities like in India, people, still migrate mainly to the 5 big mega cities in India. About 17% of India's urban population is concentrated in these 5 cities compared to less than 10% in China. I think that's another problem. And a related problem to geography is the fact that we don't trade enough with our neighbors. In fact, if you look at this region, the intra-regional trade is among the lowest in the world that we have out there. So I'd say that that's what is negative. And the other point I do feel is that I think that, we at times get a bit caught up in our own echo chamber bubbles, which is the fact that everyone thinks India is fine when the rest of the world is not doing well and stuff like that. We should always sort of mind that hype. As you know, I have that line in the book which you've reminded me of as well, which is that this is a country that's consistently disappointed the optimists and the pessimists. Right? That's the history of India, basically. Every time you think it's the next China, something happens to sort of derail it. Every time you think that you're too pessimistic on India, right, something happens to sort of make it resilient. Like a new government comes into power. In 2013, we were also pessimistic about India, and there was great hope which came up in 2014, and the country is much more resilient. So I'd say that about India, I still expect that sort of steady as she goes kind of economy, but every time you think this is the next China, it doesn't quite work out.
So at this point, please feel free to join in. Just raise your hand. You can't just let the 2 of us monopolize Ruchir. So is anybody right now? Or?
Just a thought. I mean, when you look at performance of a leader, I'm just trying more from a business point of view, just shifting to business. When you start, you're full of energy and you're acquiring business. And then at the second phase, because you acquired and you've built your fiefdom or kingdom, then you have to defend. And suddenly you have this attacker's disadvantage or the advantage of the attacker. So how much do you really bring in the context? I haven't read your book. I have it in my library. I'm here to read it, just got to be honest about that. But how do you think context is important? Because I think that end of the day, it's leadership is about really being conscious about the context, right? So any views on that, Ruchir?
Can you?
As I said that, this is just a general observation, and I agree that the context is something which can help to change this, right? So in terms of the fact that how the dynamic is playing, there are some leaders who have bucked this rule. And my entire sort of talk is that of the 10 rules, I don't have any rule, maybe apart from the kiss of death rule, on which I have a 100% probability on anything. So on this too, it's perfectly possible that the context helps determine what's going on in the way you explain it, and it's perfectly possible that the current government led by Mr. Modi sort of shows a different pattern to this rule. But my entire thing is to help increase the probability of identifying which nations are going to succeed and which are going to not succeed. And on that, I think that we are, that's what I'm trying to do here. But there's no certainty. I'm loath to people who sort of tell me there's a certainty about anything.
Only certainty, as Disraeli said, I believe, is about death and taxes.
That's right, yeah.
All the rest can vary. Ashok Advani.
I have really a question. You talked about Modi and what expected in the first 2 years. Two things. One is we forget that he was Chief Minister of Gujarat for 3 terms. And while he was there, he didn't denationalize any state undertaking. If you remember,
Yes.
there was a time when Gujarat State Fertilizers was the blue chip.
Not just that, in fact, he protected them.
That's
He
right.
gave them state patronage.
Similarly, when he talked about GSPCL, he talked about overtaking our friends Reliance. What happened to these companies? Now, why do you expect? Also, sorry, again, one more linked point is if you go back to NDA 1, you had Yashwant Sinha talking about maintaining the public sector character of the banks, in spite of the fact that the BJP had opposed nationalization roundly. So why should one really expect some of these changes for Modi to make? Or are these changes, ways of life that we as a nation have accepted, sadly, but we have to live with?
No, so my point is not about expecting. I never expected much of in terms of this, and I don't expect any of this to change just now. So I agree with you. This is just a fact of life about India I have to accept, but I think we have to highlight about there has to be a critical movement which highlights how the value of these companies is being destroyed. Like you spoke about NDA 1. You look at what's happened to the telecom sector since then, in terms of where MTNL and BSNL are today. Where is the stock price as one indication of these companies? The MTNL stock price since then is down 90%, and the private telecom operators are up 1,000%. Someone needs to know as to who's benefiting from all this. So my point is just to highlight in terms of what's going on. Do I expect it to happen? I don't. And I think that what works in one state, whether it works at a national level, I don't know. And the only point I'm trying to make is that you have to that even if you retain the public sector character of the banking sector, should your ownership be more than 70%, which matches that only of North Korea? So I agree, but it's not about expecting, it's about the fact that, like, is this something we should, when you're scoring countries on a global basis, on this I would rank India poorly, whereas like some of the scores I would rank it highly.
Microphone goes to Amish now. Amish is a celebrated author, bestseller, but many people don't realize he was a banker for a very long time.
I was a banker for 14 years, but I'll base my question on my other passion, history.
Yeah.
There have been 2 broad theories at approaching history. One is the great man theory, that usually great men, sometimes great women, have come in, strong leaders, they put their stamp on history. If you go by this theory, then it was Queen Elizabeth,
Yes.
various other, Queen Catherine, various others who led the rise of Europe. Then there's another theory, which is the bottom-up theory. There are forces of change, and leaders can just come to sometimes manage that change, but even if they aren't there, the force of change itself is so strong, a historical process, that it carries a country forward. Like in Europe, there's the perspective that perhaps the Black Plague was actually a blessing in disguise, because average incomes went up. The break away from the Catholic Church, which was led by England and many other countries, brought in the Protestant work ethic. Do you look at India from this perspective? If you put the great man theory aside and we look at historical forces of change, cultural, demographic you've spoken of, but cultural, various other aspects, have you looked at this aspect in India, and how do you see this playing out for us?
Okay, great. So I think, I'll make 2 points here. One, that in the book, what I've said very categorically is that this is a practitioner's guide to the world. And by practitioner, I mean it's about people with a time horizon I've made very clear is 5 to 10 years to try and predict change. I think that anything beyond that, I said so even in the past that, the old rule of forecasting used to be that you forecast so often that you keep reminding people when you are right. The new rule of forecasting now had become that you basically forecast so far out in the future that neither you nor I'll be here to remember whether I was right or wrong. So I'd say the change, here is the fact that I'm very conscious that 90% of us are practitioners, politicians, business people, investors. We can't go back to people and say that, hey, the country will be fine in 20, 30 years from now. you vote for us now and suffer for it just now. It just doesn't work that way, right? I mean, most people are assessed on 3 years, 5 years, someone on every quarter virtually in terms of it. So my entire thing is of keeping the time horizon relevant, and now there's a huge academic community which writes books looking at like hundreds of years of history and what works and what doesn't work. Some have geography as theory, some have institutions as theory. My point is I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to stick to the next 5 to 10 years. In that time frame, I think that leadership does matter, but it's not the only factor. There are 10 rules as stated there, and there's no country that I will completely cross out all because the leader is bad. Even in Russia today, I'm seeing some positive signs for change in terms of what's going on. But India, though, I will make one point, and I think that some of us travel when there are elections in India. We have done it for the last 20 years or so, and I think that generally the conclusion is that the more time you spend in Delhi, the more pessimistic you feel about the country, and the more time you spend traveling to outside of Delhi, the more optimistic you feel about the country. And I think that that is something we feel, like every time I come back from some of these election trips, we saw the transformation of Bihar like over the last 10 years. We were in Bengal. We saw the transformation even in Bengal in terms of 5 years, how development had moved up. It's not universal. Tamil Nadu is moving the other way, is what we saw. But generally, so I think that India is very much about 29 leaders rather than just one leader. And I think that is something which is still underappreciated there, because the conversation tends to be about one leader. But about India, I'm conscious of the fact there are 29 leaders, and it's much more federal than most countries. So I'd say that like all these leaders matter a lot more. Like we never had this instance. I remember that as we've seen the last few years, that you got chief ministers from Haryana and Andhra Pradesh who show up in New York requesting for meetings and requesting for investment summits. We never saw that.
So this conversation is really hotting up now and getting more and more interesting. And we haven't even covered 1/3 of the world as yet. So don't go away. Come back after this short break.
Ruchir, we've talked about the book, your view about countries and all that. I just want to ask you something about your career in the US and what made you choose US over everything else. There are a lot of young people here who are thinking about their careers over the next 10 or 20 years. How should they be thinking in the context of how you thought, considering you're so brilliant about thinking about the world as a whole?
Don't get a PhD, don't get an MBA.
Yeah, very true, because I was going to, in the mid-1990s, as some of you may know, that I began as a writer in India after high school. Basically, I was writing for for publications like the Economic Times, and I was very keen to go and do my PhD in the US. Luckily, some people at Morgan Stanley happened to read what I was writing and stuff, and their comment to me was, do you want to make money or do you want to study? I said, I want to make money, and I gave up the option of going to do a PhD or an MBA. So I feel a practitioner's way of approaching stuff, that's what really helped, that, of being a practitioner. About going to the US, it was just a natural evolution. I love being here, like in India. Every time I come to India, there's a spring in my step, like in terms of here, and I come to Bombay and stuff like that. But yet, I hate to say that it depends what your passion is. If you want to be a global thinker or be a global player, there is no place like New York. I'm biased, but it is the capital of the world in some ways, so that's the reason for being there. It's got to do with what my passion is. But there's one little anecdote that my first opportunity to go to the United States was in 1998, where they were very keen to move me out there, like in 1998, just after the East Asian financial crisis and stuff like that. I went there as a young kid in 1998, and I was at Morgan Stanley. I wasn't even a vice president. I was some associate and stuff like that. And I figured out when I went there that I can't keep a maid at this salary. I can't have an apartment in central New York. I don't want to move. So people were aghast in New York at that point in time that what sort of a guy is this that we're offering him this and he won't. I came back to India, as you know. I ran the Indian funds, Indian office. I really enjoyed myself doing that. Then in 2003, again, the opportunity came up. They said, no, you have to move this time in 2003. I said, fine. I said, I'll come on one condition. But by then you had established a track record here. I said, I will come as long as you bring me here on an expat package. So in America, they were stunned that we give expat packages to go the other way. Why are you demanding an expat package to come back here? But by then, so it was just passion, which is that you went when the time was right for it. And otherwise, when I was here in India in the late 90s and early 2000s, I loved it. I was very happy being here. But then you thought that if you really want to do something global, that's the base.
One question, are we over-focusing on economic growth? I mean, is it become the only yardstick and a very easy yardstick for the world to measure how people are doing? I mean, in general, how they're feeling. And where does art go? Where does music go? Where does, poetry go? Where does feelings go? Where does religion go? A lot of other things which are important.
That's
Where are
as a poet, not as an ad man.
Yeah, no, but listen, it's hard to argue against that, but because I knew that I'd be asked such questions and I've answered them in my book, like to some extent. So here's what I did, which is that what is the ultimate goal in life? Happiness, right? So we had to look at, there are, luckily like in this world, there are people who do surveys for everything. So there are people who do surveys about happiness as well. And there are happiness indices as to where countries stand on that. And here's what we found. Which are the happiest countries in the world? This is just evidence. People with the highest per capita income. That the richer you are, generally, as a country, the happier you scored on the happiness index according to all the surveys which were done. And the poorer you are, the less you scored well on that. Now, I know that this is not very poetic to you because it sounds much more poetic to say that if you're poor, you're still happy, you're sleeping on a hard bed and life is still fine. But the economic evidence is my job to present to you. And what the economic evidence shows to me is that poverty is not a very happy thing. And the richer nations you are, now again, there'll be exceptions. Someone will always tell me, hey, what about Bhutan? Bhutan seems very happy out there. Again,
but Bhutan has to hold a census first.
So yeah, but the thing is that the general relationship across the world that we have looked at is that the richer the country, the higher the per capita income, the happier you are. So in the end, the goal I think has to be to get higher per capita income. That you want the average person to be richer over time rather than poorer over time.
So Ruchir, when does India get to a $10,000 plus per capita income in our lives?
No, I think that my best, as I said, that I can easily say that in our lives because nobody will hold us accountable. So it's the easiest forecast for me to make.
So we're currently at $1,800.
That's right. So I'm sure we'll get there in terms of it. Whether we get in our
your life maybe.
But we have to be sobered by the fact that Sri Lanka is 1.5 times ahead of us in per capita incomes. Question in the back. Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, I'm Rajat Sabarwal from Credit Suisse. And this started off with a question on Russia, and I just wanted to talk about the other part, which is China, and you have navigated, despite your views, quite well in that geography. You're saying that China hard landing has already happened with 2 to 3% growth. I wanted to talk a little bit about you. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts in China going forward from here. How does she go forward from here with the economic growth that exists? What kind of risks politically and economically which exist and which will have impact on overall Asia region and world at large?
Yeah. So I think that if you look at China, I was saying earlier that of the 10 rules we looked at, most of them we assess on a probabilistic standpoint. But if there's one rule in which I have the most confidence, it's on our rule called the kiss of death. And I think that many people here from business communities will understand this. What is this rule? Which is that what is the single most important and consistent factor which has led to economic slowdowns, end of economic miracles and financial crises. It is when a country takes on too much debt over a short time horizon, and we zoned it down, which is that over a 5-year time horizon, if your debt levels went up by more than 40% as a share of economy, that economy always suffered economic trouble in the subsequent 5 years because you're really borrowing from the future to do it now. China was a country that I used to be optimistic on. Like many of us here, we grew up being in awe of China, what they had achieved, infrastructure, investment, and stuff.
Now you call it ugly.
Yeah, because of something changed in the last 5 to 6 years, which is that after the global financial crisis, as they started to slow down, they still wanted to grow at the same old rate. So they pumped in massive amounts of debt to keep growing, and no developing country in recorded history has taken on as much debt as China has taken on in the last 5 to 6 years. And now, for an evening conversation, this is a bit technical, but I want to leave you with one statistic about China, which you should keep in mind. Today in China, it's taking $6 of debt to create $1 of growth in China. At the peak of the US housing bubble in 2008, it was taking $3 of debt to create $1 of growth in the United States. This is out of control. Now, a lot of the debt is internally held. It's not held by foreigners, so nobody comes calling for the debt. And it's all between friends. You keep passing the parcel and nobody comes calling for the debt. But this is an unsustainable situation. And so therefore, the forecast I make in the book is that the next global recession will be made in China, much like everything else these days. And I think that the important point here also is the fact, like the small things, Brexit. In 2 or 3 days, it's come and gone. Look at what happened in China last August and again earlier this year. There were such convulsions across the global economy, India getting so badly affected. So keep telling people that if you're looking for trouble, look east, not west.
And you see, unlike most of the stuff China manufactures, the trouble that comes there, recession that comes there might be more durable. Listeners, which we shall try to accommodate if your questions are short.
We've clearly been when you talk about different practitioners, we've been the most unpopular of practitioners for the longest time. But I think about a decade ago, when the subprime crisis hit the world, that's when your profession started to give us competition.
Right, I agree.
And therefore, my question would really be for the two bankers on stage, for Uday bhai as well to answer that what do you think as senior bankers, as global bankers, that your fraternity needs to do to once again restore confidence amongst not just depositors and people in the banking ecosystem, but the voter at large? Because whatever we've been talking about, whether it's Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, what's happening in America, what's happening in India, is largely a manifestation of the subprime crisis, the protests in Europe against austerity measures, that snowballing into Occupy Wall Street. So it would be interesting to hear from both of you what you think bankers should be doing in the years ahead.
Well, I'm very clear that I'm increasingly upping my public profile as an author rather than as a banker. So I'm very clear. I agree with you. Yes, I agree with you.
He's got that base covered.
I think it's a very relevant question, and I was asked this question about in 2009 at the peak of the global financial crisis, and my answer is that the banker of today and tomorrow needs to ensure 3 human qualities at all points of time. The first one is simplicity. Therefore, don't sell or mis-sell complex products to your clients, and don't make it exotic. Keep it simple, stupid for a customer to understand. So first human quality is no creative disruption, simple. Second is prudence. Bankers have believed that they are masters of the universe. There were banks at the peak of the global financial crisis at debt equity ratios of 50:1, which means if 2% of the loans went bad, the bank was bankrupt. So prudence is not blowing your balance sheet beyond a point. And third, and this is extremely important, is a very simple human quality called humility. For the banker to succeed for now and in the future must have 3 qualities: simplicity, prudence, and humility. That's what will make the future.
Namita, I saw you raise your hand right there.
My question is, how much do you think the economic elite of a country needs to participate in the overall growth and development of the country, and how? And have you seen a change in the way India's economic elite has behaved in the last 20 years that you've been sort of watching it? You know, Arundhati Roy had once said that India's elite has seceded into outer space. So really it sort of lives in its own bubble.
Yeah, no, that's true. You know, for whatever it's worth, one observation I make in the book is that technocrats are bad prime ministers. Because if you look at the long history of the world, there are very few technocrats who have done well as prime ministers in a democratic society. So I think that, you know, this is true in other countries too. So I think that one thing is very clear, that our top leadership always needs to be political in nature. And I think this is, in democracies, this needs to be true. So, I mean, even for Manmohan Singh, I mean, like, nobody questions his role as a finance minister and what he did there, but as a prime minister and what he did, especially in the second term, is unfortunately sort of rather sad in terms of it. So one thing is clear, that the top jobs in have to be held by politicians because they connect with the masses. Elites don't. Technocrats don't. And they've failed in many parts of the world.
Uday, you have any closing comments or any question?
Yeah, I think this is back to Ruchir. Now that you're clear that you're deserting us and becoming more and more a book writer and a journalist, this book, which is a New York Times bestseller, titled as Rise and Fall of Nations.
Yes.
I think it's a great title and a great book. And my question to you is, and you've been writing books every 4 or 5 years?
No, second book in 2 years. Sorry, in 4 years.
4 years, okay. So 4 or 5 years from now, when you write your next book, what is the probability that the title of that book is The Rise and Rise of India?
Yeah, that's great. Well, I think that, as I said,
you know what will sell.
I think that it's quite, as I said, that when I sort of objectively apply these rules, I feel relatively optimistic on India compared to other countries. I feel optimistic on the entire South Asian region, which I didn't expect myself when I first started it. Even in basket case countries in this region like Pakistan, etc., we're seeing some improvement take place. So I think that there is a I feel generally okay about it. What I do fear a lot is triumphalism and hype. But I know that really kills many a country. When we believe that, listen, we're growing at 8%, why do we need to do anything? Because India is destined to do well. India, destined to do well because of bottom-up forces, and we don't need anything to be done at the top. That's the kind of stuff that I feel a bit wary about, and I would like stuff to happen there. Like to sort of keep the pressure on. That listen, we need to do X, Y, Z to sort of improve.
Victory too soon.
Yeah, we declare victory too soon.
Like the celebration now that our growth rate is higher than China's.
Right.
It's on a 20% base of China's.
That's right. So I think that's it. But yes, I'm a bit spent out after having written this book. But the book that I would one day like to write is based on all our election travels of the last 20 years. Because what we learn in India in that week of being out, I find is extraordinary.
And in fact, that is so well said, because many of us friends of Ruchir are in fact very grateful to him, because he forces us to leave Delhi. He comes from New York and forces us to leave Delhi during the elections, and the wisdom you then hear, you can never hear in studios or even in forums like this. And I have 2 things that I remember forever. One was this rally in Bihar where Rahul came 4 hours late, and Rahul said, basically he told everybody that your lives are a mess. आप गरीब हो, आपके लिए कुछ नहीं हुआ, आप पिछड़े हो. And we saw this one man sitting with his stick, and we asked him, वो क्या कह रहे हैं? And he said, वो कह रहे हैं कि, and Rahul said, 2 भारत बन गए हैं, एक शाइनिंग है, एक डिक्लाइनिंग है. तो हमने कहा वो क्या कह रहे हैं? कहता वो कह रहे हैं साहब कि 2 भारत बन गए. तो हमने कहा आप क्या कह रहे हैं? साहब हम कह रहे हैं 60 साल आपने राज किया तो 2 भारत बना दिए, 5 साल और देंगे तो 3 बना देंगे. Right? So these are very smart people. And the second one, I think it was a village outside Allahabad, and you remember that house?
Yes.
Well-to-do family, retired college professor. His 3 sons were employed, their wives were employed. He sat on his cot with a fan that wasn't moving. He was in a dhoti and with streams of perspiration, and he was half paralyzed. And we asked him, Bijli kab aayegi? So he said, मौत और बिजली क्या पता कब आ जाए. So things like this, wisdom like this, you can only figure out when you travel around the country. And really, India is so deeply democratic that really is our strength. So Ruchir, thank you very much for doing that, and thank you all for being here.